Hey guys, so like a cow, I forgot to record today, but luckily this was another day where it was very heavily exercises, and so this video shouldn't really be too long. I now have an alarm that goes off at 3:20 from every Monday, Wednesday from now on, so I should never forget to record again. But I'll kind of talk about what we covered as a class, but again, because of the quiz, which was 20 minutes, and then there was probably like, I don't know, like 45 minutes of exercises, you really didn't miss too much from not having the recording. Okay, so we kind of picked up with these cartoons talking about dplyr and wrangling data. So this cute little guy is supposed to be us. And then this is all the data that we're kind of wrangling and getting under control. At the end of the last class, we had started talking about mutate. And so this is a nice little visual for this, or for this function. And so mutate keeps all of the columns in your data set, but then it adds a new one. And it looks like for this particular example, it's adding the two columns together to make this new column C. And so you should, if you're not already there, go to your week 2 project. In the little tutorial section, you should be able to use this little navigation bar to navigate down to, we left off roughly at back to mutate. And I think at the end of last class, we had talked about this share women variable. And then we had talked about how we needed to name the data set after we mutate it. And most of the time when people mutate to make a new variable, they just name the new data set the same thing as the old data set. That won't always be the case, but for mutate it works pretty well. So I'm reading this, I'm going to click this down arrow to make sure I have all the code above it. And then I'm reading this, all right, take majors df, make this new variable called unemployment rate, calculate unemployment rate by this little formula, and then print it so that I could see and make sure it's doing what it's doing, and call that majors df. And so now when I reference majors df, unemployment rate will always show up, which will be useful for us since we could use it in the future. Same thing goes for this share women variable. And so that was calculated as the number of women in the major divided by the number of men plus the number of women. If you run that, now when you type in majors df, you should see share women appear as one of the variables as well as unemployment rate, which is good since now we can reference those. If you scroll down to the next chunk, this is just a note that instead of making those variables separately, you could keep piping and just make them in one kind of big long pipe step. That does the same exact thing. Or you could even make variables in one mutate step. And so if you're making more than one variable in a single mutate step, you're separating by a comma. And so that's just does the same exact thing as the other two things did. And so in R, there's always like 10,000 ways to do stuff. Oftentimes it's nice that there's so many different ways, so you could pick one that you kind of prefer. This is the most succinct way because you're just using a single pipe and you just have a single mutate function, so it's usually a little bit easier to read. Okay, and so if you kind of remember, we had made this grifting major, and so tail will give the last few observations of a data set, and then printing with width affinity will give all of the variables. And so we did that because we wanted to see how these different functions would behave if there's missing values. For grifting, when we make the new variables, it gives the new variables NAs for missing. That's generally what we would expect it to do, right? Like if we don't have the number of women or the number of men in the data set for grifting, then share women would also be missing because we don't know the proportion of women. So it's doing something kind of that makes sense. And so R makes the new variables NA also, so that they're also missing. All right, and so at this point we took a little bit of a brief diversion to talk about data ethics, something that we'll talk about kind of scattered throughout the semester. The ethical question that we talked about here is, so we're thinking about comparing the number of men and the number of women in each of these majors. Is it ethical to do that without considering non-binary genders? So some people don't identify as men or women, so they're non-binary. They're not included in our analysis. Is that ethical? Points that people brought up are that it might depend on the purpose of the analysis, and so that might affect whether you think it's ethical or not. We talked about how sex and gender are defined differently, and we acknowledge that we're not experts in this. And so I think sex, if you're using it like medically, then people were a little bit more comfortable. We had settled a little bit on kind of doing the comparison, but at least acknowledging in our analysis that there are non-binary genders, but that they weren't included in the data, and so that's why they're being excluded. That at least gives some sort of context as to why we're making these decisions. And I think it's nice for people who are not, do not identify as men, male or female. It's nice that they're at least acknowledged. At least I think so, though I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination. Just doing the best we can. So something like a one-sentence statement would be maybe that the data set we used for this analysis didn't include non-binary genders, so we are only comparing those who identify as male and those who identify as female. Or something like that. Again, this, I mean, I'm a statistician, not a, gosh, I don't know what this would quite fall under. Some humanities field, I suppose. So I'm really just doing the best that I can and trying to be as inclusive as I can, which is something that I think we should all strive to do. Okay, the last topic before we moved on to the exercise portion was this if-else and case-when. I'm going to actually go ahead and stop the video and make a second video for this, just in case you kind of also want to stop and need a break. I kind of need a 3-minute break from talking, I think. So there'll be a second video talking about this if-else and case-when.